The dawn of February 21, 1916, broke gray and cold over Verdun. Frost hung like ghostly lace on the bare branches. Deep within the German lines, thousands of artillery barrels pointed toward the French forts. Lieutenant Franz Müller, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, raised his binoculars. He could barely make out the distant hills of Douaumont and Vaux through the fog. Then, at 7:15 a.m., the sky shattered. A deafening roar rolled across the Meuse valley. Hundreds of guns thundered at once, shaking the ground like an earthquake. Forests splintered. Villages vanished into smoke. The German offensive had begun. Müller's hands trembled as he watched the bombardment. "Gott im Himmel," he whispered. "It's like the world is ending." Far across the valley, Captain Henri Dubois crouched in a dugout near the front line. The bombardment was endless, a rain of fire and iron. Earth and men were tossed into the air together. Communication lines snapped, trenches collapsed, and the air became unbreathable with dust and cordite. Private Louis Martin, barely 19, clutched his rifle with white knuckles. "Captain, will they stop?" he shouted over the thunder. Dubois shook his head grimly. "No, son. This is only the beginning." For 9 hours, the shelling continued. Over 2 million shells fell on the French lines, an average of 1,200 shells every minute. The countryside that once held quiet farms became an inferno. When the guns finally paused, it was not silence that followed, it was the scream of infantry whistles. German troops surged forward, gray uniforms ghosting through the smoke. "Positions!" Dubois roared. The surviving Frenchmen scrambled up the shattered trench. Machine guns opened up, raking the advancing line. Men fell, but more came. Lieutenant Müller advanced behind them, carrying a map case. He saw twisted trees burning like torches and the dead lying in grotesque shapes. One French shell burst near him, throwing him into a crater. Dirt filled his mouth, but he crawled up again. By sunset, the Germans had taken the first French positions. Villages like Haumont and Beaumont fell one by one. The French line was bleeding but unbroken. At midnight, Dubois wrote in his journal by candlelight, "Verdun burns. The air smells of death. They want to bleed us white, but they will not take our soul." Outside, Verdun's church bells still stood silent, but standing. By the end of February 1916, the German advance pressed toward the heart of Verdun's defense, Fort Douaumont, the largest of the French forts. Once a symbol of invincibility, it had been stripped of most of its guns earlier in the war. Only a small garrison of elderly reservists remained. Inside, Corporal Pierre Laurent walked the dim concrete corridors. The smell of oil and damp stone filled the air. "We are forgotten," he muttered. Outside, snow fell silently over the ruined landscape. Meanwhile, the Germans prepared for the strike. Sergeant Otto Weber, a young engineer, was ordered to lead a small detachment to capture the fort. Their orders were clear: move fast, avoid destruction, and secure Douaumont as a shelter for German troops. Under cover of smoke, Weber's team approached the fort through shell holes and broken wire. French sentries were scattered, confused by the ceaseless bombardment. The heavy guns had pounded Douaumont for days, but the fort itself remained mostly intact, its massive walls sunk deep into the earth. Weber crawled up a collapsed trench and reached a narrow opening. Inside, silence. He lit a small lantern. The corridors stretched into darkness. He could hear only dripping water and distant rumbling. "Forward," he whispered. Laurent and his men heard noises echoing through the passage. "Rats again?" one joked nervously. But then came German voices. By sheer luck and boldness, Weber's men captured the fort with barely a shot fired. The stunned French garrison surrendered. When word reached the German high command, it was celebrated as a miracle. Newspapers in Berlin screamed, "Fort Douaumont falls. The gate to Verdun is open." But for the men on the ground, it was no victory, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The fort's tunnels soon filled with hundreds of soldiers seeking shelter. Fires broke out, and the stench of unburied corpses mixed with smoke. Far away, in the French headquarters, General Philippe Pétain received the grim news. He stood silent for a moment, then said, "We shall hold Verdun." No one passes. Orders went out through the night. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. Captain Dubois and his battered company were reassigned to reinforce the city's defenses. As he marched through burning villages, he saw civilians fleeing with what little they could carry. He saluted them silently. In the distance, the captured fort of Douaumont burned under a blackened sky. March 1916. The Meuse hills smoldered under endless gunfire. Every ridge was chewed by shells, every forest a skeleton of trees. The French army, exhausted and bleeding, looked toward one man for salvation, General Philippe Pétain, newly appointed to command the defense of Verdun. When Pétain arrived at Sully headquarters, he studied the maps quietly. His gray eyes traced the front lines like a doctor examining a dying patient. "We will not counterattack blindly," he said. "We will hold. We will supply Verdun at any cost." The first miracle he ordered was not of battle, but of logistics. Only one road, the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way, still connected Verdun to the rest of France. Trucks roared along it day and night, carrying shells, food, and men into the furnace. Mechanics stood ready every kilometer to repair breakdowns. Every 14 seconds, another vehicle passed. Captain Dubois and his platoon were among those riding toward the city. As the convoy rumbled through shell-scarred villages, Dubois looked out the window of the truck and whispered to Martin, "Remember this road, boy. It feeds the soul of France." At the same time, Pétain visited the front lines. The men saluted him with tired eyes. He spoke not with speeches, but with calm words. "Courage, mes enfants. You are the shield of France." He inspected their shelters, their rations, their artillery positions, everything. Soldiers began calling him Le Sauveur de Verdun, the savior of Verdun. In the trenches, Dubois's men endured the daily torment of bombardment. They slept in mud, ate from tin cans, and lived among the dead. "It smells of hell," said Martin one evening, lighting a cigarette. "No," replied Dubois softly, "hell smells better than this." Each night, the horizon glowed red. The Germans struck again and again, hammering the French lines around Douaumont and Vaux. But now, the French guns answered in equal fury. Pétain's system of rotation kept the divisions fresh. No unit was allowed to die in Verdun forever. Lieutenant Moreau watched the general one evening as he dictated orders. "Sir, the men believe in you," he said. Pétain looked up slowly. "Then we must be worthy of their belief." By late March, the Germans realized Verdun would not fall easily. Their plan to bleed France white had turned into a grinding match of attrition. Both sides lost tens of thousands. The Meuse River ran brown with earth and blood. On a cold evening, Pétain visited a forward trench where Dubois and Martin stood guard. The general removed his gloves, shook their hands, and said, "You are France. Hold fast." For the first time in weeks, Dubois felt warmth in his chest, not from fire, but from faith. Verdun, once doomed, was now defended by will. The hero of Verdun had arrived. April 1916. The war had taken to the skies. Above the shattered fortresses and craters, biplanes droned like angry hornets. For the first time, the soldiers of Verdun fought not only across the ground, but across the heavens. Lieutenant Franz Müller sat in the rear seat of his Albatros C.I observation plane, goggles iced over by cold wind. Beneath him stretched the wasteland of Verdun, a landscape of smoke and red flashes. His pilot banked hard to avoid a French shell burst. "Verdammt," Müller cursed, clutching his camera. His mission: photograph enemy positions for the German artillery. Far below, Captain Dubois squinted upward from his trench. "Look at them," he said to Martin. "Men trying to tame the sky while the earth devours us." Moments later, French anti-aircraft guns barked. Black puffs of smoke blossomed around Müller's aircraft. The German flyers managed to photograph Fort Vaux before turning back, but a squadron of French Nieuports pounced. A swirling dogfight erupted in the orange dusk. Tracer rounds stitched across the sky. Müller watched a plane burst into flames, spiraling down like a fiery leaf. "Poor fool," he murmured, unaware it was a French pilot returning from his first flight. On the ground, the aerial war looked like fireworks above a graveyard. "The sky burns now," said Martin. "Even God must look away." Meanwhile, German artillery, guided by those photographs, unleashed another storm. The shelling was so intense that night turned to day. Dubois's trench shook violently. "Hold your heads down," he shouted as explosions ripped the parapet apart. A fire spread among ammunition boxes, and men scrambled to put it out with mud and coats. Across the field, Sergeant Weber directed engineers repairing Douaumont's defenses. His men wore gas masks as smoke and poison seeped through the air vents. "Keep pumping fresh air," he ordered. In the gloom, candles flickered beside wounded soldiers lying on stretchers. The fort had become a tomb that breathed. By midnight, rain began to fall, a thick, oily rain that mixed with ash and blood. The fires dimmed but never died. Dubois wrote in his small notebook, "The heavens burn, the ground moans. If this is victory, what is defeat?" At dawn, Muller's damaged plane crash-landed near the German lines. He limped away, his camera still intact. Inside it lay the images that would help rain more shells on Verdun, yet his eyes were filled with tears. "Why photograph hell?" he asked softly. Over the next days, both sides paused briefly, too exhausted to fight. Smoke rose in columns that met the clouds. Soldiers stared silently at the glowing horizon, a sky of fire above a world of ruin. Early May 1916. The front near Verdun was a cemetery without tombstones. Trenches had vanished under layers of mud, rubble, and bones. Yet somewhere between the chaos and courage, a legend was born, the Trench of Bayonets. Captain Dubois led his exhausted company into a forward position near Douaumont Ridge. The trench was shallow, its walls crumbling, but it was home for now. The men dug by lantern light, their shovels clinking against helmets buried beneath the earth. Sergeant Reynaud wiped sweat from his brow. "We're digging our own graves, Captain." Dubois nodded grimly. "Maybe, but we'll hold until relief comes." At dawn, the Germans began another bombardment. The air trembled as shells whistled down. Men pressed themselves into the mud, praying. One shell struck directly on the trench, collapsing part of it. The sky rained dirt and fire. Private Martin clung to the wall, coughing. "Captain, we can't move." "Stay down," Dubois shouted. "Stay alive." For hours, the world was nothing but thunder and flame. Then came silence, the terrible, hollow silence that followed every bombardment. The survivors looked around, stunned. The trench was half gone. The dead lay half buried, rifles still upright, bayonets glinting through the dust. Dubois crawled to a wounded man. It was Reynaud, blood running from his forehead. "They'll come now," Reynaud whispered. "Hold the line, sir." "Rest easy, Marcel," Dubois replied softly, though he knew his friend was fading. From the German side, Lieutenant Muller observed the aftermath through binoculars. He saw no movement, only a strange sight, a row of rifles standing above the ground, bayonets pointing to heaven. He turned to his commander. "Perhaps they are all dead, buried standing." The German officer snorted. "A soldier's grave, then. Let's move on." But the French did not forget. When the battle shifted months later and Verdun was reclaimed, they found that trench, the rifles still in place, the skeletons of soldiers buried upright beneath them. It became known as La Tranchée de Bayonets, the Trench of Bayonets. That night, as rain poured and shells flared on the horizon, Dubois sat by a lantern and wrote, "We live only by the courage of those already gone. They stand still, bayonets to the sky, eternal sentinels of France." June 1916. The Germans turned their fury toward Fort Vaux, the last bastion guarding the approaches to Verdun. Inside its cold, damp corridors, Major Sylvain Raynal commanded a garrison of only 600 men. Their supplies were low, their throats dry, but their spirits unbroken. "Men," Raynal said in a hushed voice, "no water, no relief, but we hold. For France." Outside, Sergeant Otto Weber prepared his engineer unit to storm the fort. They moved through smoke and gas masks fogged, bayonets fixed. Machine gun fire rattled from the fort's embrasures, cutting down the first wave. Weber shouted orders, "Flamethrowers. Bring them forward." The flames hissed to life, spraying orange death into the corridors. The air turned into fire. Inside, the French fought back with grenades and revolvers. The walls shook, the tunnels filled with choking smoke. Private Martin had been sent to deliver a message from Pétain's headquarters. He crawled through shell holes and debris, bullets whining overhead. Reaching the fort's entrance, he found it half buried under rubble. He pounded on the iron door. "Open. I bring orders." The door groaned open just enough for him to slip in. Inside, it was a nightmare, men gasping for air, bodies lying in the corners, candles guttering out. "Water, water," someone moaned. There was none left. The men licked the damp walls for moisture. Major Raynal received the message, a promise of reinforcements that would never come. He tore it slowly. "Tell General Pétain we held," he said to Martin, his voice hoarse. "Tell him we fought like lions." For 3 more days, the defenders resisted every German assault. Weber himself was burned when his unit tried to breach the lower tunnel. "They fight like demons," he muttered, respect in his eyes even for his enemies. On June 7, 1916, with no water and hundreds wounded, Raynal surrendered. When he emerged from the fort, his men barely standing, the German commander saluted him. "You are brave men," he said. Raynal simply replied, "We did our duty." The fall of Fort Vaux was another German triumph on paper, but it cost them dearly. And for the French, it became a legend of endurance. That night, Captain Dubois heard the news in a trench nearby. He closed his eyes and whispered, "They shall not pass, but some must fall." June 1916. Verdun was a furnace that never cooled. Every day the front demanded new men, new shells, new courage. And every day, one lifeline kept the city alive, the Voie Sacrée, the sacred way. The road stretched from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, 60 kilometers of dust, mud, and motion. Trucks thundered day and night, their engines growling like beasts of burden. Tires tore through the ruts made by thousands before them. Along the way stood repair crews, mechanics, cooks, stretcher-bearers, a living artery feeding the heart of the battle. In one of those trucks sat Private Louis Martin, hands trembling on the steering wheel. His truck carried shells and bread, both as vital as the other. Rain lashed the windshield, turning the road into a river of filth. Behind him, other trucks honked in rhythm, a metallic heartbeat. "Keep her steady, Martin," shouted his sergeant from the passenger seat. "I'm trying," Martin replied, gritting his teeth. "The road's eating us alive." On the side of the road, soldiers marched toward Verdun, silent, gray-faced, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Others, wounded and broken, trudged in the opposite direction, some without helmets, some without hope. The road carried both life and death. At the command post, General Pétain watched the endless line through his field glasses. "This," he said to Lieutenant Moreau, "is our salvation. So long as the sacred way lives, Verdun lives." "Sir," Moreau asked quietly, "how long can we keep this up?" Pétain didn't look away. "As long as France breathes." Meanwhile, Captain Dubois and his platoon worked to clear wrecked trucks from the road. One had been struck by a shell, its cargo of ammunition scattered. Flames licked the mud. Dubois waved men back. "Keep moving the others. The road must not stop." Under enemy fire, they pushed wrecks aside, filled craters with boards, and guided new convoys forward. The sky glowed with distant flashes, and the smell of oil mixed with cordite. At dusk, the column paused briefly. Men climbed from their trucks, stretching stiff limbs. Martin sat on the bumper, staring into the valley where Verdun burned. "Sir," he asked Dubois, "do you think it's worth it, all this?" Dubois looked toward the horizon. "Ask me after we've won." That night, the trucks rolled again, headlights dimmed to slits. From a distance, the sacred way looked like a trail of fireflies, a moving miracle. For every shell that fell, one more was delivered. For every man who died, another arrived to take his place. Verdun endured because that road did not break. It became more than a path, it became a promise. July 1916. The Germans launched a furious new assault toward the ruined village of Fort Douaumont, once a quiet hamlet of stone cottages and apple trees. Now it was nothing but smoke and bones, yet both armies fought for it, as if it were a throne. Captain Dubois's unit had been ordered to defend the shattered remains. They crawled into what was once a church cellar, now a cratered bunker. The ground above them trembled under artillery. "The Boches will come soon," Dubois said, loading his revolver. "We give them nothing for free." At dawn, German shells howled again. The air turned black with dust. Sergeant Weber, leading an assault group, moved through the chaos. "Forward," he yelled. His men surged across no man's land, bayonets gleaming. In the ruined streets, the two forces clashed hand to hand. Rifles jammed, grenades rolled across rubble, and men fought with shovels, fists, and rage. The screams of wounded mixed with the roar of guns. Private Martin ducked behind a collapsed wall. A shell exploded nearby, showering him with bricks. He fired blindly into the smoke, his ears ringing. "Captain," he shouted. "They're breaking through." Dubois ran to his side. "Then stop them." He stood atop the debris, revolver in hand, firing until the cylinder clicked empty. A German bullet grazed his shoulder, but he didn't fall. From above, Lieutenant Muller's plane circled low, photographing the carnage. Even through the lens, the destruction seemed unreal, like a nightmare sculpted in fire. "So much death for a village with no name left," he whispered. By midday, Fleury was nothing but a cratered ruin, but the French still held pieces of it. Dubois rallied his remaining men around a broken stone cross, their last landmark. "Hold here," he said. "If we fall, Verdun falls." Weber, bleeding from his arm, crawled into a shell hole and looked back at the inferno he had unleashed. "We have taken the ground," he said softly, "but lost our souls." That night, rain poured down again, washing blood into the Meuse. Fleury had changed hands 16 times in a single month, burned, rebuilt, and burned again. When the guns finally fell silent for a few hours, not a single building remained standing. Dubois looked around the lifeless village and murmured, "Even ghosts would fear this place." August 1916. The air above Verdun belonged to no man. It was a shifting sea of smoke, wind, and fire. Where once the birds had flown, now roared the machines of death, fragile wooden planes with hearts of steel. Lieutenant Franz Müller climbed into the cockpit of his new Albatros D.2. The dawn sky was painted blood-red by the fires below. "Ready, sir," called his mechanic. Müller nodded. "For the fatherland," he said quietly, though his voice carried no pride, only weariness. The propeller spun. The plane leapt into the sky, leaving behind the screaming of shells for the wind's cruel song. Below him stretched Verdun, a vast wound on the earth, oozing smoke and ruin. The forts of Douaumont and Vaux were like dark scars in a land without color. Across the lines, Adjutant Charles Guynemer, the young French ace, prepared for takeoff. His Nieuport 17 gleamed silver in the morning light. Mechanics loaded ammunition belts. "You'll find them near Thiamont," a fellow pilot told him. Guynemer smiled faintly. "If I return, I'll tell you what clouds taste like." Moments later, the two men met, strangers, enemies, yet brothers in the madness of flight. High above the Meuse, their planes spiraled toward each other like hawks. Tracer rounds crossed the sky in golden arcs. From the trenches below, Private Louis Martin looked up, shielding his eyes. "Captain, look," he shouted to Dubois. "They're dancing in the clouds." Dubois raised his binoculars. "Dancing?" he muttered. "No, lad. They're dying with style." The duel lasted minutes that felt eternal. Muller's bullets tore through Guynemer's wings. Guynemer rolled sharply, diving under his opponent. For a moment, they locked eyes, two young men suspended between heaven and hell. Then Guynemer fired. Smoke burst from Muller's engine. The German plane spiraled down, trailing black ribbons. Müller wrestled the controls, teeth clenched. The ground rushed up to meet him. At the last second, he pulled the nose up just enough, crashing in a field behind German lines. He crawled from the wreck, coughing blood, staring at the sky. "He spared me," he whispered. Or perhaps the sky did. Above, Guynemer circled once, saluting the fallen foe, then turned for home. His plane vanished into the haze as the ground continued to burn. That night, Dubois wrote, "Even the sky is at war. Yet amid the flames, there are still gestures of mercy, proof that the soul of man, though buried, is not dead. September 1916. Verdun's hills were torn to shreds. Forts had fallen, villages erased, forests burned to ash. Yet the French were not broken. Under the new offensive spirit of General Robert Nivelle, they prepared to strike back. Their target, the fortified German position at Douaumont. Captain Dubois's company was among the chosen. They had been reforged in the fires of Verdun, veterans, ghosts, survivors. Standing before them, Dubois spoke softly, "We are not fighting for ground. We are fighting for the right to breathe free on French soil." At dawn, French guns unleashed fury. Thousands of shells screamed across the Meuse, shaking the valley for miles. Dust and flame filled the sky. The men advanced behind the barrage, stepping over twisted wire and corpses. Private Martin carried the tricolor flag at Dubois's side. Bullets whistled past. "They'll never stop us now, Captain," he shouted. "Don't tempt fate," Dubois replied. Inside the German lines, Lieutenant Franz Müller, his arm still in a sling, watched the bombardment from a dugout. "They're coming again," he told Sergeant Weber, who adjusted his helmet with trembling hands. "We hold or we die, sir," Weber answered. The French stormed forward, shouting "Vive la France" as machine guns tore into them. Men fell in waves, but the rest pressed on. Smoke covered the battlefield like a shroud. Dubois led his men through a shattered trench. "Grenades!" he cried. Explosions tore through German bunkers. Martin planted the flag atop a collapsed fortification, just as a shell burst nearby, throwing him into the mud. "Martin!" Dubois rushed to him. The boy was alive, barely. "Did we win?" Martin whispered weakly. Dubois looked around at the chaos, the ruins of Douaumont, now littered with the dead of both sides. "Yes," he said, though victory smelled like ashes. By nightfall, Douaumont was back in French hands. Nivelle's message to headquarters was short. "Douaumont is taken. Verdun stands." In the German camp, Müller stared into the darkness. "We take, we lose, we take again," he muttered. "Verdun devours us all." The guns quieted for a few hours, leaving only the sound of the wind whistling through broken wire. Dubois sat beside Martin's stretcher, whispering, "You did well, my friend. Rest now." Above them, the torn flag fluttered weakly in the smoke, the only color left in a world of gray. October 1916. The battle had raged for 8 endless months. Verdun was no longer a place, it was a wound that refused to heal. Captain Henri Dubois sat in a shallow dugout, his uniform stiff with dried mud and blood. Around him, men lay half asleep, half dead, breathing through rags that smelled of mildew and gas. In a corner, Private Louis Martin, still weak from his wound at Douaumont, cleaned his rifle in silence. Outside, the wind carried a strange sound, the moaning of the wounded lost between the lines. Sometimes, at night, they cried out in both French and German. It was hard to tell who was who anymore. Dubois lit a cigarette, its glow briefly lighting the faces of the men. "The dead outnumber us now," he murmured. Martin looked up. "Then they'll hold the line if we fall." In the German camp across the valley, Lieutenant Franz Müller listened to the same cries. "They're still out there," said Sergeant Otto Weber, who was tightening bolts on a damaged machine gun. Müller rubbed his temples. "We cannot even bury them. Verdun has become a graveyard that still breathes." That night, fog rolled across no man's land. It was so thick that sound seemed to vanish into it. Dubois sent out a patrol to search for wounded, volunteers who called themselves the Ghosts. Martin went with them despite his injury. Crawling through the mud, they stumbled upon a crater full of bodies, French and German, mixed together. One of the Germans was still alive, whispering for water. Martin hesitated, then gave him his canteen. "Merci," the man whispered, before dying with a faint smile. When they returned, Dubois asked softly, "Did you find anyone?" Martin nodded. "Yes, Captain. Just not the living kind." At dawn, both sides resumed shelling. The explosions tore apart the same ground for the 1,000th time. Yet somehow, the trenches still held, as if the land itself refused to die. Later, when Dubois received orders to hold for another week, he laughed bitterly. "Another week? What's another century?" Miller, writing in his own notebook that same night, penned similar words. We live among the dead and envy them. The men who wouldn't die are the most cursed, because they must remember. As the sun rose, lighting the ruins of Verdun in a red haze, both men, enemies who would never meet, stared at the same horizon and whispered the same prayer. Let it end. November 1916. The guns never stopped, but amid the chaos, men still wrote letters that tried to make sense of madness. In a quiet moment between bombardments, Private Louis Martin sat in a dugout with a piece of torn paper and a stub of pencil. My dearest sister Sophie, he began, his handwriting shaking with cold. It has been many months since I saw a blue sky. The world here is gray and brown, and men vanish like smoke. But I am still alive, and I dream of the river near our home. I can almost hear it when the guns stop, though they never really stop. He folded the letter carefully and handed it to Captain Dubois, who gathered the mail for the runners. Will they reach Paris, sir? Martin asked. Dubois smiled faintly. If the gods of war allow it. Across the lines, Lieutenant Franz Müller wrote too, though his letters were never sent. His wife's address had changed after a bombing, and the field post had been destroyed. Still, he wrote, Anna, the mud here is deeper than sorrow. I no longer remember my own voice, only the thunder of guns. If I come home, it will be as someone else. I hope you'll still know me. He sealed the note and placed it in his breast pocket, next to his identification tag, just in case. Back in the French trenches, Dubois read one of his own letters from home. It was from his wife, Elise. Our son walks now, it said. He asks when you will come home. I tell him soon. Dubois folded it and stared into the fire. Soon, he whispered, though he no longer believed it. 2 days later, a German shell struck near the French post office dugout, setting the letters ablaze. Hundreds of messages, last words, last hopes, went up in flames. Men rushed to save them, but the fire consumed too quickly. Martin watched the smoke rise. Our words are burning, sir, he said quietly. Dubois nodded. Then they'll reach heaven faster. That night, both sides fired flares that illuminated the battlefield like a false dawn. Müller, gazing up at the drifting lights, thought they looked like paper letters flying through the night sky. Months later, when the snow finally fell over Verdun, villagers would find fragments of burnt letters scattered in the mud, words of love, apology, and longing carried by the wind. The war may silence men, Dubois would write later, but not their hearts. The letters of Verdun never truly die. December 1916. Verdun lay frozen beneath a crust of snow and ash. The winter came not as mercy, but as another torment, a cold so sharp it bit through wool and skin alike. Captain Henri Dubois walked the trench line, his breath turning to frost. The men huddled under tattered blankets, their rifles frozen, their boots stiff with ice. The silence between shell bursts was heavy, filled only with the sound of shivering and whispered prayers. Fire's dying again, muttered Private Louis Martin, crouched near a tin stove that gave more smoke than heat. Dubois tossed in a scrap of wood. If hell has a season, he said softly, this must be its winter. Across no man's land, Lieutenant Franz Müller and Sergeant Otto Weber faced the same misery. Their trench walls were caked in frost, their hands cracked and bleeding. Müller stared at the sky, where flakes of snow drifted like falling ashes. It's beautiful, Weber said faintly. Müller nodded. Yes, even death looks pure under snow. That week, the fighting slowed. Men were too cold to hate. Instead of battles, there were strange truces, silent exchanges of mercy. A French patrol found a wounded German near the wire and dragged him in. Dubois gave him hot soup, though the man could barely drink. Tell your people, Dubois whispered, that we are not beasts. The German died the next morning. In Paris, far from the front, Sophie Laurent, Louis Martin's sister, worked in a hospital overrun with the wounded. The air smelled of carbolic acid and candle wax. She read letters aloud to men with bandaged eyes, her voice trembling. My dear sister Sophie, one letter said, the snow here hides the dead, but not the fear. I hope one day to see your face again, not in dreams, but in the sun. The letter ended without a name. She didn't know if it was from her brother, but she wept anyway. By Christmas Eve, the guns had fallen oddly quiet. Soldiers on both sides lit small fires, shared bread, and sang songs that drifted across the snow. "Silent night," whispered Martin. "Holy night," answered a voice from the darkness, in German. Dubois smiled tiredly. "Even the enemy remembers God tonight." For a brief few hours, Verdun was silent, not with death, but with the ghost of peace. But as dawn came, the first shells shattered the stillness once again. The war resumed, as if ashamed of its own tenderness. "The snow has melted into blood," Dubois wrote later. "Winter gave us hope for one night, then took it away forever." February 1917. The end of Verdun was near, though no one knew it yet. Orders came down from General Charles Mangin: reclaim Fort Douaumont. Once the pride of France, Fort Douaumont had fallen to the Germans early in the war. Now, scarred and haunted, it waited like a sleeping beast. Captain Henri Dubois stood before his weary men. "Gentlemen," he said, "we take back what is ours. We've bled for every stone of this land, let this be the last one." Private Louis Martin, his face pale but eyes burning, whispered to a comrade, "If I die there, at least it will be on French soil." At dawn, artillery thundered again, shattering months of silence. Shells pounded the fortress until it seemed the earth itself was crumbling. Then the infantry moved, climbing over the frozen ground, charging through smoke and fire. Inside the fort, Lieutenant Franz Müller and Sergeant Otto Weber braced for impact. "They're coming," Weber gasped. "Then let's welcome them," Müller replied, tightening his pistol grip. The French stormed the tunnels, bayonets flashing in the flicker of lanterns. The air was thick with smoke and screams. Dubois led his men through a corridor strewn with corpses. At one corner, they clashed hand to hand with German defenders. Steel met flesh in the dim light. Martin saw Müller, though he didn't know his name, wounded and slumped against a wall. For a moment, their eyes met. The Frenchman hesitated, gun raised. Müller, bleeding from the shoulder, simply nodded, a silent surrender. Martin lowered his weapon. "Stay still. It's over." By nightfall, the French flag once again flew above Fort Douaumont. The men cheered weakly, too tired to celebrate. Dubois stood beneath the flag, watching the horizon. "Verdun lives," he whispered, "but at what cost?" Across the ruins, Müller was taken prisoner. As he passed the French lines, Martin caught his eye again. Neither spoke, they simply shared a look of understanding. Later, Dubois wrote in his journal, "The fort is ours. Yet I feel no joy, only emptiness. We have won a tomb." Outside, the sky glowed orange as the fires of Verdun burned one last time. March 1917. The snow had melted into a sea of mud. Verdun breathed again, but it was the breath of a dying giant. In the German lines, General Ernst von Zell prepared his final push. "We will break them once and for all," he told his staff. "No more stalemate. No more waiting. Verdun will fall." But his men were hollow-eyed, worn from a year of hell. Sergeant Otto Weber, clutching a rusted helmet, whispered to a comrade, "We've already fallen, sir. The ground just hasn't buried us yet." At dawn, the German guns roared again, one last storm of fire and iron. The French positions vanished beneath a wall of flame. The air turned black with smoke and dust. In the French trenches, Captain Henri Dubois shouted over the noise, "Hold your ground. Verdun stands." Private Louis Martin ducked as a shell burst nearby, throwing him into a wall of earth. His ears rang, his vision blurred. "Captain," he shouted, but the words were lost in thunder. Wave after wave of Germans advanced through the mud, bayonets glinting. French machine guns tore them apart, but still they came. Bodies piled atop bodies, an ocean of uniforms swallowed by the land itself. Dubois climbed onto the parapet, revolver in hand. "Not one step back," he cried. The men followed him, faces streaked with mud and fear. By midday, the front was chaos, smoke so thick men couldn't tell friend from foe. In one shattered trench, French and German soldiers found themselves side by side, firing blindly into the same haze. Amid it all, Lieutenant Franz Müller, now a prisoner in a rear camp, listened to the rumble of guns from afar. It's ending, he told a guard softly. But not for those still out there. The guard nodded. They'll fight until nothing's left. At dusk, the German offensive collapsed. The fields were littered with the fallen, a graveyard stretching from fort to river. Dubois stood among his surviving men, unable to speak. Martin handed him a canteen. It's over, sir, he said. Dubois shook his head. No, Martin. Verdun doesn't end. It just keeps bleeding slower. That night, rain began to fall, washing the blood into the earth, as if the land itself tried to forget. April 1917. The guns had fallen mostly silent. Verdun, the name that had devoured men and hope, was at last still. The soldiers called it the Valley of Shadows. Nothing grew there. The trees were skeletons, the rivers thick with mud and rust. The ground itself smelled of smoke, as though the world had been burned and never cooled. Captain Henri Dubois walked the field with Private Louis Martin. Between them, silence spoke louder than words. Every step crunched on shell casings and bones. This was once a forest, Martin said quietly. Yes, Dubois replied. Now it's a cemetery. In a makeshift camp near Fort Douaumont, General Charles Mangin read the latest reports. The Germans had withdrawn. The French line held. Verdun unbroken. But Mangin did not smile. We have won, he said to his aide, but who remains to celebrate? In the prisoner camp nearby, Lieutenant Franz Müller sat beside a small fire, his face thin and pale. When a French nurse offered him soup, he hesitated. You feed the enemy? He asked softly. We feed men, she replied. That night, Dubois sat by the Meuse River. The moon reflected faintly on the water, a mirror of ghosts. Martin joined him, carrying 2 tin cups. To Verdun, he offered. Dubois shook his head. To those who stayed. They drank in silence. In Paris, Sophie Laurent received a telegram. Private Louis Martin alive. Returning home. She read it twice, hands trembling, tears falling onto the paper. Back at Verdun, Dubois gathered his men for one final order. We will leave this place tomorrow, he said. Do not look back. Verdun will never let you go if you do. The next morning, as the sun rose over the ruined forts, the soldiers marched away slowly, like ghosts leaving the battlefield. In the mist behind them, the valley was silent once more. Only the whisper of the wind remained, carrying faint echoes of gunfire that would never truly fade. Verdun, Dubois wrote in his last entry, was not a battle. It was a test of what men could endure and what they should never endure again. The war would go on elsewhere. But Verdun's story had ended, carved into the heart of the earth and the souls of all who survived. May 1917. Verdun was quiet, too quiet. The guns had stopped, but the ground still groaned beneath the weight of the dead. When the wind blew, it seemed to carry voices. The soldiers called them echoes of the fallen. Captain Henri Dubois remained behind with a small burial detachment. He moved slowly through the wasteland, recording names from shattered dog tags, marking graves where he could. One morning, he stood over a trench filled with nameless men. Father Jean Rousseau, the chaplain, stood beside him, whispering a prayer. Are they French? Dubois asked. Does it matter? Rousseau replied softly. They all prayed to the same God in the end. Far away, Private Louis Martin returned to Paris. The train clattered through the countryside, fields blooming again, as if nature had forgotten the war. He watched the green blur past the window, feeling both joy and guilt. At the station, Sophie Laurent waited. When she saw him limping down the platform, she ran forward, tears in her eyes. Louis. He smiled weakly. I told you I'd come home. She hugged him tightly, whispering, not everyone did. Meanwhile, in a French prisoner camp, Lieutenant Franz Müller sat under guard. The French treated him with decency, though his eyes were empty. He wrote in a small notebook, his final journal. We fought for honor. We died for mud. The dead do not care who won. They whisper in every gust of wind, asking only to be remembered. In Verdun, Dubois and Rousseau continued their work. Some graves bore crosses, others only stones. Each time they placed a marker, Dubois whispered the same words. You are known to God. That evening, Dubois sat beside the Meuse River, watching the sunset bleed red across the horizon. It looked like the sky remembered. "Father," he asked quietly, "will men ever learn?" Rousseau sighed. "They will forget first. That is their curse." Back in Paris, Louis struggled to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes, trenches, faces, fire. Sophie sat by his bedside. "You're safe now," she said softly. He shook his head. "No one who saw Verdun is safe." Across France, bells rang for victory. But for those who had fought, there was no victory, only survival. The echoes of Verdun would never fade. "The war gave us ghosts," Dubois wrote in his final report. "They live in the silence after every gunshot, in the hearts of those who walked away." June 1917. In a wooden barracks on the edge of Verdun, Lieutenant Franz Müller kept a diary. It was small, bound with string, its pages damp from the rain. He wrote not as a soldier, but as a man trying to remember who he had been. "Verdun," he wrote, "is not a place, but a sound. It hums in your bones long after you leave. At night, I hear the earth sigh, as if the dead are restless." He had been captured at Douaumont months before. Now he worked repairing roads near the ruins he once defended. Each day he passed the same cratered ground. Sometimes he saw French soldiers doing the same, filling trenches, removing shells, building again. One afternoon, Captain Henri Dubois rode by to inspect the works. Recognizing Müller, he dismounted. "You fought at Douaumont," Dubois said quietly. "Yes," Müller replied. "And you retook it." The two men stood in silence, watching workers rebuild what their nations had destroyed. Dubois finally spoke. "We both lost the same friends." Müller nodded. "Then let us both remember them." Later that evening, Dubois visited the camp again. He handed Müller a small notebook, Müller's own diary, which had been found by a soldier after the battle. "You kept this," Dubois said. "You should finish it." Müller opened the cover and smiled faintly. "Then perhaps Verdun will finally have a voice." In Paris, Louis Martin began working at a train station, helping veterans and refugees. Sometimes he saw men with empty sleeves or faces hidden by bandages. He would stop, salute, and say nothing. Words were too small for the memories they shared. Sophie Laurent, now working in a rehabilitation center, read aloud to patients from newspapers and letters. One day she received a package, a book, handwritten, titled The Prisoner's Diary. Inside was a note. "To all who lived Verdun, from one who survived it on the other side." It was Müller's diary, translated and published with Dubois's help. It spoke not of victory or defeat, but of endurance, of men who suffered, feared, and forgave. The book spread quietly across France and Germany. For many, it was the first time they saw the enemy as human. Perhaps, Dubois wrote in his foreword, "The last act of Verdun is not battle, but remembrance." Months later, when Müller was finally released and returned to his homeland, he carried with him one item, a small French tricolor ribbon, given by Dubois. From a soldier, Dubois had said, to another. When Müller crossed the Rhine, he looked back once at the west, toward Verdun, and whispered, "Rest, old battlefield. Rest." July 1917. For the first time in over a year, Private Louis Martin stood on a road that did not lead to death. It wound through the French countryside, green again with summer, dotted with flowers that had not existed when the war began. He walked slowly, leaning on a wooden cane, his uniform faded, his soul older than his years. Along the road, civilians waved small flags and shouted, "Vive la France!" But Louis only smiled politely. He had seen too much to cheer. Captain Henri Dubois traveled beside him in a rattling truck, watching the fields roll by. "It feels strange," he said, "to see color again." Louis nodded. Verdun had only two colors, brown and red. They passed through villages still scarred by shells. Children played among ruins. Mothers washed clothes in rivers that once ran dark. At one stop, Louis saw a group of veterans, men without arms or legs, sitting in silence outside a tavern. One of them raised a bottle. "To Verdun!" he shouted hoarsely. Louis raised his hand in salute. "To those who stayed," he whispered. In Paris, Sophie Laurent waited at the window of their small apartment. When Louis finally arrived, she almost didn't recognize him. His shoulders were broader, his face lined, his eyes distant, but when he smiled, she saw her brother again. She embraced him fiercely. "You're home." He looked around the room, small and warm, with the smell of bread in the air. "Home," he repeated softly, as if testing the word for the first time. That evening, he sat with Sophie by the window as the city lights flickered on. "Do you think people will remember Verdun?" he asked. "They must," she replied. "You lived it." He shook his head. "No. We survived it." "That's not the same." In a quiet church near Verdun, Father Jean Rousseau rang the bell for evening prayer. Captain Dubois entered, removing his cap. "For the fallen?" he asked. "For the living too," Rousseau replied. "They carry the heavier burden." Dubois knelt and whispered, "If they must remember, let it be with peace, not hatred." That night, the road home stretched under a pale moon, winding endlessly through villages, forests, and memories. For the men of Verdun, every step away from the battlefield was a small act of resurrection. August 1917. The war had moved elsewhere, but Verdun was still alive in whispers, in ruins, in grief. A new monument was being built, the cemetery of Verdun, where thousands of unknown soldiers would rest together, side by side. Captain Henri Dubois stood among the rows of white crosses, each one identical, stretching into the horizon like an ocean of silence. Father Jean Rousseau blessed the ground, his voice trembling as he spoke the names of the fallen. "Too many names," he murmured, "and not enough lips to say them." Private Louis Martin, now dressed in civilian clothes, visited carrying a single wildflower. He knelt before a nameless grave. "I don't know who you were," he said softly, "but I remember you all." He placed the flower gently in the mud. Across the border, Lieutenant Franz Müller, now free and back in Germany, stood before a small churchyard where his own comrades rested. In his hand was a letter, one he had written to Dubois. "Captain Dubois, we fought each other as enemies, but I think we understood each other as men. If ever you visit Verdun again, please place a flower for me, for all of us who fell on the wrong side of history." Weeks later, the letter reached Dubois. He read it beneath the gray skies of Verdun and smiled faintly. Then, honoring Müller's wish, he placed a white flower among the French graves. When Rousseau saw him, he asked, "Who was it for?" "For someone who fought bravely," Dubois replied, "and forgave." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, a soft rain began to fall. The crosses gleamed wet in the fading light. Dubois and Martin stood silently side by side. "Does it ever end, Captain?" Martin asked. Dubois shook his head. "Not really. But maybe that's how it should be. So we never forget." From a distance, the wind carried the faint sound of church bells, echoing across the valley that once screamed with fire. Now it whispered peace. "Verdun is a grave and a lesson," Dubois wrote in his final letter to Paris. "It teaches that courage is not in killing, but in enduring and remembering." As night fell, mist rolled over the fields, covering the crosses like a blanket. Verdun slept at last, watched over by the living and the dead alike. October 1917. The railways were full again, not with soldiers going to war, but with men coming home. The prisoners of Verdun returned in silence, faces pale, hands trembling. Some wore bits of their old uniforms, others just gray coats and hollow eyes. Lieutenant Franz Müller stepped off a train near Frankfurt. The station was crowded with families shouting names, waving photographs. A woman nearby cried, clutching her husband's sleeve as if afraid he might vanish again. Müller stood quietly, holding a small satchel and a folded French letter. He had spent months in captivity, working on reconstruction under French supervision. Now, free at last, he felt no triumph, only emptiness. A boy ran up to him. "Papa?" Müller smiled sadly. "No, little one. I'm sorry." The boy's mother hurried forward, pulling him away. Müller watched them disappear into the crowd. In France, Captain Henri Dubois received word that the last German prisoners were being exchanged. He watched the departing trains without hatred, only thoughtfulness. Father Jean Rousseau joined him on the platform. You could have gone home weeks ago, Rousseau said. Dubois nodded. But Verdun isn't finished with me yet. Meanwhile in Paris, Private Louis Martin volunteered to help at the refugee center. He guided the returnees, both French and German civilians, through lines for food, clothing, and medical care. Sophie Laurent, now serving as head nurse, organized bandages and medicine. Some of these men, she said, don't even know what day it is. Louis looked at one German prisoner being treated for frostbite. They look just like us, he whispered. They always did, Sophie replied. Days later, Muller arrived at a small border station, where French officers oversaw the final releases. Captain Dubois happened to be among them. When Muller saw him, he hesitated, then saluted. Dubois returned the gesture. Lieutenant Muller. Captain Dubois. They shook hands, the handshake of men who had once aimed rifles at each other. I read your diary, Dubois said. It helped people understand Verdun in ways we couldn't. Muller smiled faintly. Then perhaps we both served France and Germany in peace. Before parting, Dubois handed Muller a small package, a loaf of bread and a ribbon of the French tricolor. For your journey home, he said. Muller bowed slightly. And for remembrance. As Muller's train rolled eastward, he leaned from the window, watching the land blur into mist. In the distance, the hills of Verdun rose faintly against the evening light, like a memory that refused to fade. War takes everything, he wrote in his final diary entry. But it gives one gift, the wisdom to never want it again. December 1917. Snow fell quietly over Paris, covering the rooftops in white silence. The war still raged elsewhere, but for Louis and Sophie, the world had finally slowed. One morning, the postman brought a thick envelope, yellowed, sealed in old wax. Sophie turned it over, reading the faded script, from Verdun, 1916. She looked at Louis. It's addressed to you. Louis opened it carefully. Inside were 2 letters, one from a comrade named Jacques, who had died at Douaumont, and another from Captain Dubois, written during the battle but never delivered. He unfolded the first one. The ink had bled from dampness, but the words were clear. Louis, if you read this, it means I did not come back. Don't let Verdun be only pain. Tell them we were afraid, but we stood. That's what matters. Louis's eyes glistened. He wrote this the night before we attacked, he whispered. The second letter was different, more solemn. Dubois had written it to all his men. If I fall, remember that courage is not the absence of fear. It is walking through fear for the man beside you. Sophie touched his shoulder gently. You've carried these words without knowing. He nodded. Maybe they carried me. Later that day, Louis visited a small church in the city. Inside, Father Rousseau was lighting candles for the wounded and missing. Louis handed him the letters. They were lost in Verdun. But they found their way. Rousseau smiled sadly. Even letters have souls. They travel until they reach the living. Meanwhile, far to the east, Lieutenant Muller sat by his own fireplace in Germany, writing one last message to Dubois. My friend, I found peace not in victory, but in the faces of those who forgave. The snow falls over Verdun now, perhaps it covers us all equally. He sealed it and placed it beside his diary. Weeks later, the letter arrived in France. Captain Dubois read it beside the Meuse, the river now calm and frozen. He looked up at the gray sky and whispered, Peace to you too, Franz. At that moment, a small flake of snow landed on the river's surface and melted instantly, gone, yet seen. The war ends, Dubois wrote in his notebook. But memory endures. It is our duty and our debt. The bells of Verdun rang that evening, not for battle, but for peace, carried on the cold wind like the echo of a promise kept. Spring 1918. 2 years had passed since Verdun's darkest days. The battlefield was quiet now, but not dead. Men and women had returned to rebuild what once seemed impossible. Captain Henri Dubois stood on the crest of Hill 304, overlooking the ruined valley. Smoke no longer rose from the earth, only mist. Birds had come back, nesting in the shattered trees. For the first time, he could hear their songs. Below, teams of workers cleared debris. Some were veterans, others civilians. They worked without complaint, their shovels striking old metal, their hands blistered but steady. Among them was Private Louis Martin, who had chosen to return to Verdun as a volunteer. He lifted a rusted helmet from the mud, its metal cracked, a bullet hole through the side. Inside was a small tuft of hair, blonde and brittle. Louis swallowed hard. "Someone's son," he murmured. A young engineer nearby overheard. "We find them every day. The earth doesn't forget." Louis nodded. "Then neither will we." In the town itself, Sophie Laurent helped reopen a small hospital. The walls still bore the scars of shellfire, but inside there was warmth, clean beds, the smell of soup, and laughter of children born after the guns had gone silent. "Every brick we lay," Sophie said to her nurse trainees, "is an act of defiance against war, against forgetting." That evening, Dubois visited Father Jean Rousseau, who had converted the old fortress chapel into a memorial hall. The walls were lined with plaques, names of the dead, from both sides. Dubois walked slowly among them, tracing his fingers across the carved letters. French. German. "Does it matter now?" Rousseau shook his head. "Only to those who refuse to learn." Dubois placed a small framed photograph of his fallen soldiers near the altar. Then, from his coat pocket, he withdrew a folded paper, Lieutenant Muller's final letter, and set it beside them. "This belongs here too," he said quietly. The next morning, Louis and Sophie stood together on the Meuse River bridge, watching sunlight shimmer on the water. "It almost feels alive again," Sophie whispered. Louis smiled faintly. "It is. Verdun breathes through us." "Verdun will rise," Dubois wrote in his final report to the Army Ministry. "Not from glory, but from memory. Its strength lies not in what was destroyed, but in what we dared to rebuild." Autumn 1918. The war neared its end. Across France, the mothers of the fallen began their pilgrimage to Verdun. They came by train, carriage, and foot, dressed in black, carrying flowers, photographs, and prayers. Sophie Laurent met them at the station. She offered tea and bread, guiding them gently through the still-scarred countryside. Some of the women had never left their villages before. Others had spent years waiting for news that never came. Among them was Madame Elise Durand, a frail woman of 60, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn photograph of her son. "He was 19, she whispered to Sophie. "They said he fell near Fort Douaumont." Sophie held her hand. "We will find the place." At the cemetery, Captain Henri Dubois and Father Jean Rousseau awaited the group. The air was crisp, the trees golden. Thousands of white crosses stretched before them. Madame Durand stepped forward, her eyes scanning the endless rows. She fell to her knees at one grave, though no name was written there. "This must be his," she said softly. "A mother always knows." She placed a violet on the earth and whispered a prayer. The other women followed, each finding a place for her grief. Dubois stood back, hat in hand. "I have led soldiers," he said to Rousseau, "but these women, they are the bravest army I have ever seen." Rousseau nodded. "They fight the longest battle, the one against forgetting." Later that day, Sophie helped the women back onto the train. As it pulled away, they leaned out of the windows, waving handkerchiefs toward the cemetery. One of them called out, "Tell them we are proud of them." Sophie smiled through her tears. "They can hear you," she said softly. That night, Dubois wrote in his diary. "The mothers came to Verdun. They brought not vengeance, but flowers. They have done what the war could not, they brought peace." When the wind rose over the cemetery that evening, it carried the scent of violets and the distant echo of 1,000 prayers. Verdun was no longer a place of death, it had become sacred ground. November 10th, 1918. The war had one more night to live. Along the Meuse River, Captain Henri Dubois and a few men remained at their posts, though no one fired anymore. Rumors of an armistice spread like the morning fog, uncertain, fragile, unbelievable. The soldiers sat around a small fire. No laughter, no songs, only silence. Private Louis Martin poked at the flames. "Do you think it's true, Captain?" Dubois stared into the embers. "If it is, I don't know how to feel." Far away, in a German village, Lieutenant Franz Müller stood in his uniform one last time, listening to the quiet. He had received official word, the guns would cease at the 11th hour tomorrow. He looked out at the fields and thought of Verdun. What does one do? He wrote in his journal. When the war ends, but the noise still lives inside? At dawn, Dubois walked alone to Fort Douaumont. The air was cold, the sky pale. The fort stood like a tomb, pockmarked and silent. Inside, he heard water dripping, echoing like distant gunfire. He closed his eyes and imagined the battle, the screams, the thunder, the endless smoke. It was gone now, replaced by something even stranger: stillness. Father Jean Rousseau arrived beside him, holding a small brass bell. When it's time, he said softly, we'll ring it. Dubois nodded. For them. At 10 minutes before 11, the men of Verdun stood ready. They faced east, where the sun was rising. Some prayed, some wept. Sophie Laurent watched from the rebuilt hospital, surrounded by wounded men who had survived too long to die now. The clock ticked closer. 10:59, 10:59 and 30 seconds. Then, at last, 11 o'clock. The guns fell silent. Not one shot, not one echo. The earth itself seemed to exhale. For a moment, no one moved. Then the wind stirred, carrying the sound of church bells from the distance. Dubois lowered his head. Louis took off his cap. Rousseau whispered, peace. In Germany, Müller heard the bells too. He stepped outside, tears in his eyes, and placed his hand over his heart. It's over, he murmured. May we be forgiven. Back in Verdun, Dubois reached into his pocket and withdrew a bullet, the last one he had carried since 1916. He dropped it into the river. No more, he said. Louis looked at him. What happens now, Captain? Dubois smiled faintly. Now we learn how to live again. The silence of the guns, Dubois wrote that night, was louder than the war itself. For in that silence, every soul cried out. November 11th, 1918. The day the world exhaled. Bells rang across France, from Paris to Verdun, from the smallest chapel to the grandest cathedral. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags, crying, laughing. After 4 years of blood, the war had ended. Private Louis Martin stood among the crowd in Paris, his cane in hand, unable to cheer. Around him, people danced and sang, but he just smiled softly. They don't know what it cost, he murmured. Beside him, Sophie Laurent wept quietly, half in joy, half in sorrow. At least it's over, she said. Louis nodded. For us. For others, it never will be. At the same moment, in Verdun, Captain Henri Dubois walked alone through the cemetery. He carried a French flag folded under his arm. Stopping at the central monument, he unfolded it slowly and raised it to half-mast. Not victory, he said aloud, but memory. Father Jean Rousseau joined him, reading from a small Bible. The Lord shall wipe away all tears, and there shall be no more war. In Germany, Lieutenant Franz Müller sat by the window of his small home, watching children play in the snow. Their laughter sounded strange to him, beautiful but distant. He opened his diary one last time and wrote, Today the war ended. But Verdun will never end. It lives in the hearts of those who stood upon its ashes and promised, never again. As night fell over Paris, the city glowed with candlelight. Sophie lit one in her window, whispering, for Jacques. For all of them. Louis added softly, for those who came home, and those who didn't. At midnight, Dubois returned to the Meuse River. The reflection of the moon danced on the water, calm and silver. He whispered into the wind, Verdun, sleep now. The bells of Armistice Day echoed faintly across France, across Germany, across the graves of 1 million men. The war was over, but its lesson had only begun. On this day, Dubois wrote in his final wartime entry, Humanity stopped killing long enough to hear its own heart. For years had passed since the armistice. The world was rebuilding slowly, painfully. In the spring of 1920, a train pulled into the small Verdun station. Among its passengers was Captain Henri Dubois, now older, his uniform replaced by a simple coat. He carried a small case filled with letters, names, and notes of soldiers who had never returned home. The platform was quiet. The air smelled of earth and grass instead of smoke. Yet when Dubois looked toward the horizon, he could still see the ghosts, invisible, but everywhere. Waiting for him was Sophie Laurent, now working for the French Red Cross. Her hair had turned silver at the edges, her eyes kind but heavy with memory. "Henri," she greeted softly. "Sophie," he replied with a faint smile. "It feels strange to walk here without hearing the guns." They walked together through the valley. The landscape was scarred, shell holes filled with water, craters turned into small ponds where reeds had grown. The land was still healing, just as they were. They stopped at a small field where Private Louis Martin was teaching local children. He drew shapes in the dirt with a stick, triangles, circles, the basics of geometry. "Education," he told them, "is how we rebuild France. You learn and you remember." When he saw Dubois and Sophie, his face lit up. "Captain. Nurse Laurent. I thought I'd never see you again." "You survived," Dubois said warmly. "You kept your promise." Louis nodded. "And Verdun kept hers. She lives again in laughter." They all walked to Father Jean Rousseau's chapel, rebuilt from stones of the old fortress. Inside, candles flickered in silence. The names of the fallen were engraved on marble, both French and German. Dubois approached the altar and placed a weathered tin box upon it. "Letters," he explained. "From soldiers who never made it home. Their families deserve to hear their last words." Rousseau placed a hand over it. "And they will. This chapel will be their voice." Outside, the children released small paper boats into the river, each bearing a name, one for every soldier they could find in the records. The boats drifted down the Meuse, carrying their memories to the sea. As the sun set, Sophie whispered, "It's peaceful now." Dubois nodded. "Verdun isn't just a place of death anymore. It's where life began again." "The children of Verdun," Dubois wrote later, "walk where once no man could live. They play on sacred ground, proof that hope endures." Verdun, 1929. A decade after the armistice, cranes and scaffolds surrounded a new structure, a vast tower rising above the Meuse Valley. The Douaumont ossuary was being built, a memorial to the unknown dead. Inside, it would hold the bones of more than 130,000 soldiers, French and German alike. Captain Henri Dubois, now gray and slow-moving, climbed the hill with Sophie Laurent. Around them, workers carved names into the stone walls. The air was thick with dust and reverence. "Do you think it will ever be finished?" Sophie asked quietly. Dubois smiled faintly. "No monument ever is. But it will stand long enough for them to be remembered." They met architect Paul Lyon, who greeted them with dusty hands and pride in his eyes. "We're almost done with the tower. When the light passes through the stained glass, it will look like dawn, the same light they never saw again." Louis Martin arrived with his students from the local school. Each child carried a small flower. They lined up silently and placed them at the base of the monument. Father Rousseau stepped forward and blessed the site. "For those who fought. For those who prayed. For those who forgave." Inside, the walls were lined with glass windows, red, orange, and gold. As the sun set, the colors painted the floor like fire and blood. Dubois stood beneath the arch and whispered, "It feels alive." Sophie touched one of the engraved names. "And it always will." That evening, as the workers packed up and the last light faded, Dubois looked out over Verdun, the quiet forests, the river winding like a silver thread, the fields reborn with grass. "We built this monument not to glorify war," he said, "but to guard against its return." Louis nodded. "Then let it stand forever, a warning written in stone." They stood together, the old and the young, as night descended and the tower's cross lit up for the first time, glowing faintly against the dark horizon. Verdun, once the graveyard of Europe, now became its heart, beating quietly, reminding the living of the price of peace. In stone and silence, Dubois wrote in his final journal, "Verdun endures. The dead speak through the wind. And we listen." Verdun, 1940. The world was at war again. The thunder of guns returned to Europe, and with it, the ghosts of Verdun stirred. Now an old man, Captain Henri Dubois sat by his window overlooking the valley. He was nearly 80. His once strong hands trembled as he held a letter from Paris. "Germany advances. Verdun may fall again." He closed his eyes. "Not again," he whispered. Sophie Laurent, now in her 60s, came to visit him that evening. She had stayed in Verdun all her life, working with the Red Cross. The two old friends sat by the fire, watching the smoke curl into the air. "They say this will be different," Sophie murmured. "War is never different," Dubois said softly. "Only the faces change." Down in the town, Private Louis Martin, now a school headmaster, gathered his students in the small chapel, the same one where Father Rousseau still presided. Among the children was his daughter, Claire Martin, bright-eyed and full of questions about the past. "Papa," she asked, "is it true the ground here still holds bones?" Louis nodded gently. "Yes, Claire. Verdun remembers. The earth never forgets." Outside, thunder echoed, not from guns this time, but from a coming storm. Rain began to fall, and with it, a strange quiet. That night, Dubois stood at his window as lightning illuminated the ossuary tower. "You survived one war," he said to himself. "May you survive another." He took his old journal, the one he had written in during the battle, and handed it to Sophie. "If Verdun falls again, promise me you'll protect this. It's not just my story, it's theirs." Sophie took it with tears in her eyes. "I promise." The next morning, German troops approached Verdun. But this time, there was no battle. The town was occupied peacefully, the ossuary untouched, its walls guarded by silence. Father Rousseau rang the chapel bell once more, not in warning, but in remembrance. Louis whispered to his students, "Listen. That sound, it's the echo of Verdun. It rings for the living and the dead." Even as new wars rise, Dubois wrote in his final entry, "Verdun remains a witness. It has seen the worst of men and still believes in their return to light." That winter, he passed away in his sleep, the sound of distant bells fading in the night. Sophie buried him on the hill overlooking the river, where peace had once begun. Verdun, 1966. Half a century had passed since the battle. The forests had regrown, the air was clear, and the scars of the trenches were hidden beneath grass and wildflowers. A group of young students gathered at the Douaumont ossuary. At their head stood Claire Martin, now a historian and guide. She carried her father's worn notebook, once belonging to Captain Dubois, and spoke softly to the children. Verdun was not a place of victory, she said. It was a place of endurance. 1,000,000 men came here, and the world changed because of them. She led them through the halls, where the names glowed faintly in the filtered sunlight. The air smelled of stone and memory. An elderly Sophie Laurent sat quietly on a bench near the entrance, her eyes closed, listening to the children's voices. She was nearly 90, her hair white, her hands folded over a small wooden cross. Claire approached her. "Madame Laurent, they're learning about Verdun today, about you, about Captain Dubois, about my father." Sophie smiled faintly. "Then they are learning about peace." She looked toward the stained glass windows, glowing red and gold. "Tell them this, child, that the war was not just fought with bullets, but with faith. Faith that someday, someone would remember." Claire nodded, her voice trembling. "We remember, madam. We always will." Sophie reached out, touching her hand. "Then my work is done." Moments later, she leaned back and closed her eyes. The light from the window fell across her face, serene, eternal. That evening, the students held candles at the base of the ossuary. The valley was silent, the stars bright. Claire stood before them, reading the final lines from Dubois's journal. "Verdun, where 1,000,000 men became one. Not in battle, but in remembrance. And as long as the living speak their names, the dead shall never die." The wind swept through the fields, rustling the grass like whispered voices. The candle flames flickered but did not go out. As dawn rose, the camera, in cinematic vision, would pull back, showing the vast expanse of the Meuse Valley, the ossuary tower glowing in the morning light, the river winding like a ribbon of silver through green hills. And in the distance, faintly, the echo of marching boots fades into the sound of wind and birdsong. Verdun silent at last. "The legacy of 1,000,000 men," the narrator concludes, "is not in how they died, but in how the world learned to live."